Good morning and welcome to the 12th edition of Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai International Lit Fest 2021, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. This session is presented by Godrej as well. Coming up now is a straight talk titled We Shall Overcome, Commanding Hope to Renew the World. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. had said, "We must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope." But we live in a world that right now more than ever throws up bleak news daily. Minorities being bullied everywhere, privacy being shoved aside for surveillance, aggressive grown adult men, including politicians, trolling Greta Thunberg ever since she demanded that we need to panic. In such a world, hope seems like a distant dream. But I have a feeling I'll find out today how to cling on to hope. To present this straight talk today, we have a political scientist who for the past 40 years has studied the rapid and destructive impact of humankind on our planet. His work is highly interdisciplinary, drawing on fields like political science, economics, environmental studies, cognitive science, social psychology, and complex systems theory. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite the fascinating Thomas Homer-Dixon to the screen. Over to you, Thomas.
Hello, everyone. It's absolutely marvelous to join you from British Columbia in Canada today. It's just extraordinary, this technology, where we can talk to each other and interact on opposite sides of the planet. It's the evening here. I think for most of you, it's the morning in India. I have deep affection for India. In the 1980s and 1990s, I traveled extensively in the country. I did field research, most recently in the late 90s in Bihar, in the state of Bihar. And I've met many wonderful scholars and had developed, I thought, at least the beginnings of a deep understanding of your culture and society, which is a truly remarkable contribution to the world. So it's particularly wonderful to be with you today from all this distance away on the west coast of North America and Vancouver Island, and to talk to you about something that concerns us all in our troubled world, and that's the matter of hope and what can be our sources of hope in this difficult time, and what kinds of hope will be best for us, will work best for us as we try to build a better world for ourselves and for our children in the future. So I've written a number of books in my life, but my most recent one is the one I'm talking about today, and it's this one, Commanding Hope, the Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril. It was the hardest book I've ever written in my life. It took me almost 8 years. I started in around 2012 and completed in 2020. Actually, I had to rewrite some of it because of the pandemic, because it had changed the context in which the book had been written. But it's a book that's fundamentally for my children, and it was motivated by my children. So let's begin with the slides, and I will give you a little sense for how the argument works in the book, and then we can have a conversation afterwards in about 20 minutes or so. You can go to the next slide, please. And this is the cover of the book that I've shown you. I think it's available around the world. It's published by Knopf Canada, but with our modern technology and the web and Amazon, we can order these books pretty well anywhere in the world now. Next slide, please. I'm just going to make a slight adjustment to my screen here. There we go. So this is a photograph of me with my children. My wife, Sarah Wolf, and I had Ben in 2005, and he's standing on the sand there and on this beach on the west coast of Canada, holding my hand. And Kate, on my shoulders. So Ben is about 7 at that point. This is 2012, about the time I started writing Commanding Hope. And Kate is about 4. So now Ben is 16 and my height. They do grow. And Kate is 13. And of course, they're becoming very aware. They're now very aware of the situation in the world. They're talking about COP26 in Glasgow. They are familiar with the trials of the pandemic, of course, having just lived through it. So at about the time that this photograph was taken in this beautiful Pacific world on the west coast of North America, I realized that they were emerging into a turbulent time, and I needed to write something that would allow them to maintain their hope in what could be a very difficult century. And that was the source of the book, Commanding Hope. Next slide, please. Because the world really does seem to be going haywire. Next slide, please. We've, of course, just experienced the pandemic that has affected everybody on the planet in absolutely profound ways, devastating harm in countries around the world, from Canada to India. Next slide, please. Enormous tension and stress and violence brought to the surface during the pandemic, because many of the people who were most severely affected by the pandemic were those who were less economically advantaged and were racialized in various ways. And somehow all of that inequality and oppression and exploitation became so much more difficult to bear during the pandemic, and started to express itself in very serious protests all over the world, especially in the United States, that often involved extraordinary brutality on the part of police forces, as you can see here. Next slide, please. Massive migrations around the world of people escaping violence and harm in their own countries, and often not being let into the places that they're trying to flee to, piling up on borders, as we've recently seen in Belarus, on the border of Belarus and Poland, and in Eastern and Southern Europe. All over the world, the Rohingya, of course, in South Asia, we're finding massive movements of people who are trying to flee hardship and find better lives. Next slide, please. Devastating pollution all over the world, and of course extraordinarily serious in some parts of India just in the recent days. Next slide, please. And then, of course, over all of it is the challenge of climate change. You may have been following some of the events and difficulties in Canada over the last year, especially in this part of the world where I live, this beautiful, magnificent corner of the planet, British Columbia, which has been on fire repeatedly in the summers in recent years. We had an extraordinary heat wave this past summer with temperatures that exceeded the highest temperatures I've ever experienced in South Asia, over 45 degrees. In fact, the temperatures at one point in the interior of British Columbia reached almost 50 degrees. And drying out the landscape and inducing this enormous wildfires that cover hundreds of thousands of hectares. And of course, releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the environment. Next slide, please. Producing smoke, all these fires, whether they happen in west coast of North America, as you can see here from 2020, or in the boreal forests of Russia, or in Africa or Brazil, and this smoke transcends borders. It travels around the planet. This smoke here, as you can see, moved way out into the Pacific, and then a few days later, after September 12, 2020, the winds shifted course, and the smoke blew back across North America, all the way across North America, out into the Atlantic, and out over Europe, and eventually circled the globe. Which just goes to show that these challenges, just like the pandemic, the climate change challenge is not something that can be isolated to one nation. It's affecting us all in very intimate ways. We inhale the pollution and the smoke, as you know from India, and as we know here in these terrible smoke events. We inhale it into our lungs, and it terrifies us in the most intimate way imaginable. Next slide, please. And what emotion does this evoke? It most immediately evokes fear. In fact, in many ways, as I mentioned in the book, the kinds of challenges we're facing around the world, in a world that seems to be going haywire, have rendered our world awash in fear. It is the dominant emotion, and there it would be concern, I think, that that this could be a century of fear. People afraid of changes in their world, of the disintegrating environment, of violence from their neighbors. As life gets hard and scarcity gets worse, and we start to fight over what remains. And there are people, next slide please, who are entirely prepared to exploit this situation. And we know who they are. You have some of your own in South Asia, and we have ours in North America. But they operate by the same script, the same operating principles, if you might say that. They build their power by turning people against each other, by dividing us from each other, and by pointing to others to say that they are the source of our problems. And so all that we need to do to make our world better is to wall those people out, or if necessary, even destroy them. This isn't a future that's going to lead us to solve problems like climate change. It's simply going to make them worse. Next slide, please. So at one point towards the beginning of the book, I ask what kinds of stories we're going to tell our children, like Ben and Kate, as they emerge into their adulthood. And I ask, is this what we'll come to believe and tell our children as the story of the world that they're going to inherit, that we're all members of a failed species, and during this century we're destined to bear witness to the devastation of our planetary home and the violent unraveling of much of what humankind has accomplished. I don't want that to be the story I tell my children. On a daily basis now, around the dining room table with Ben and Kate, we're having the conversation about what their aspirations are and what they can hope to achieve in their future and what the future will bring to them. And this story is always just below the surface for them, whether I articulate it or not, because they know enough now to see what the possibilities and to be afraid themselves, what the possibilities are for the future. Next slide, please. Which brings us to hope. Hope is the antidote to fear. If we have hope, fear becomes manageable. But the problem is, next slide, please. Well, hope may be essential, and I argue it is in the book. I argue that it's a foundational emotion that is necessary for our very personal and social well-being. There are some people who argue we can do without it. I think they're, frankly, idiots. And I make a very strong argument within my book that hope is an essential emotion. But it's complex. It's tangled. People have deeply ambivalent attitudes towards it frequently. And it's been the subject of a great deal of criticism. And so we need to address those criticisms directly. Next slide, please. And I want to make sure that we have the right one in front of me here, one in front of you. There we go. Yes. So the criticisms tend to be in three categories. And you find that folks who are critics of hope as an emotion and as a critical pillar of our strength in dealing with the challenges we're facing. The critics tend to fall into these three categories. They declare that hope is either false, it's naive, or it's passive. It's false, they would say, because it contributes to wishful thinking. We tend to bend the data or bend the evidence so that it can support false hopes. And we're not realistic about the situation we face, and hope naturally induces us to deceive ourselves, to live in illusions about what is possible in the future. So that hope is necessarily false or inevitably false. That's one criticism. Another criticism is that hope is naive. And usually this criticism focuses on the idea that for most people, they're naive about what the possibilities are in the future. They don't have a clear vision of the future of that towards which they can orient their hopes. And so they're sort of just wandering around in a fog when it comes to what they want in the future. And then finally, there's this criticism, and this is perhaps the most common one, that hope is fundamentally a passive emotion, that it encourages us to sit back and let events come to us. We sort of just hope that things will turn out okay, instead of actually engaging with the world and making them okay, and changing things so that they can be better. I think these are all legitimate criticisms of our conventional understandings of hope. Next slide, please. And in my book, I respond by juxtaposing my own notions of hope that fall under the general rubric of commanding hope, by juxtaposing each one of my own notions of hope, of three elements of hope, against the false hope, the naive hope, and the passive hope. And these are the ideas of honest hope, astute hope, and powerful hope. Now, the title commanding hope is intentionally a double entendre. It's intentionally intended to sort of evoke two ideas in our minds. This kind of hope I'm articulating in the book is a hope that commands our attention because it's a powerful form of hope. It's muscular. At the same time, it's a hope that we have, in a sense, made do our bidding. It's something that we have created ourselves. We've commanded it. We've commanded the hope and shaped it so that it can be a powerful form of hope and work in our favor. So it has that kind of double meaning, this idea of commanding hope that I emphasize within the book. And commanding hope is honest. It's ruthlessly realistic about the nature of the challenges we face. It's grounded in scientific understanding, for instance, of problems like the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. It doesn't deal in falsehoods. It doesn't deal in fake science. And it looks squarely at how difficult our situations are. And when it comes to something like climate change, the problem is just extraordinarily serious. We don't fool ourselves about it if we have commanding hope. Commanding hope is also astute. And this means it's smart. And I mean smart in a particular way, that this hope is grounded in a rich understanding of the worldviews and perceptions of the people around us whom we have to work with, or perhaps against, or around, in order to solve or address the challenges we face. So it's very astute about who can be our allies, who are going to be our implacable enemies, and what the strategic pathways are for getting forward towards the world we want. So it's not naive at all. It has a clear vision of what kind of future we want in the future, what kind of future we want and that we hope for in the future. And then finally, commanding hope is powerful. It's powerful in the sense that it motivates us to be agents to actually change our situation, to look for, to search for possibilities that can make our world better, and ways of addressing the kinds of grave challenges that I outlined at the beginning of this talk. So commanding hope is honest, it's astute, and it's powerful. And in the book, I go through each one of those three characteristics of this particular kind of hope and discuss them in considerable detail. I'll say a little bit more about them now for the next few minutes in this talk. Next slide, please. There's a deep tension between hope and honesty, of course, especially in dangerous times, because in dangerous times, like now, we're afraid. And so we're inclined, next slide please, we're inclined to fool ourselves about how dangerous the situation is. I love this cartoon, it's in the book. It echoes, of course, the famous film by Al Gore about climate change that foresaw many of the challenges we're facing now. But of course, people don't want to go to that film. They want to go to another film that makes them feel better about their possibilities in their lives, even though ultimately, by not paying attention to how serious the situation is, they don't address the climate change situation, and ultimately it gets worse and more dangerous for them. But we've been lying to ourselves collectively. We've allowed our leaders to lie to us because that's made us feel good. And now we have an absolutely cataclysmic problem around the world that's affecting us all. Next slide, please. So not only must commanding hope be honest, we have to stop lying to ourselves, it must also have a very clear vision of a desirable future. And in the book, I spend quite a bit of time outlining the fundamental principles of security, of opportunity, of justice, and of common identity around which we should build that vision of a desirable future. It will be articulated in different ways in different societies around the world, but I think collectively humankind can understand that if we're going to live together on this very small planet, we have to share at least a rough and ready vision of how we're going to get along and how we're going to solve our common problems. And the principles of security, opportunity, justice, and identity seem to be a pretty good place to start. Next slide, please. And if we want to motivate ourselves to really change the world, we have to make hope an active form of hope. Commanding hope is a hope to, not a hope that. Not a hope that we're going to keep the world to no more than 1.5 degrees warming, but a hope to ensure, to actually work to make that happen. I hope to is always followed by a verb. It's an active form of hope. We're not sitting back and waiting for a good world to come to us. We decide to actually go out and make it true. So commanding hope is a hope to form of hope. Next slide, please. Now, this doesn't mean this is going to be an easy challenge. We're in a world where we have a kind of bifurcation or two possibilities of futures in front of us in terms of the worldviews that people have. And in the book, I talk about these worldviews of fear and hope. I label them the Mad Max worldview and the Renew the Future worldview. And I try to lay out in some detail how the norms and the ethics and the moral commitments and the beliefs differ between these two perspectives. Next slide, please. Some of you may recognize that this is a shot from the latest film in the Mad Max series, Fury Road, which is a remarkable metaphor for dystopia, a future possible dystopia in which people are fighting over water, over the basic necessities of life. This is not the future that any of us want our children to grow up in, but it's a future that we could be rapidly heading towards unless we seize our opportunities and mobilize our hope to make the world better. Next slide, please. As the famous Australian system scientist says, Will Steffen says, we need to reach a social tipping point before we reach a planetary one. Before the world's climate systems, its biodiversity, its forests, its water systems, its hydrological systems shift to a new state that can't be changed back to the benign state that have allowed human civilization to flourish up to this point. We need to actually change our societies. We need to tip our societies in new directions so that they can live peacefully together on this planet and solve our problems collectively. Next slide, please. Now, you might say, well, that sounds very nice. How are we going to do that? And I don't have all the answers in this book, but I think I at least start us some ways down the road for what that world might look like and how we get there. And one point I make is that the situation we face on this planet now, what is it now, 7.8 billion of us, is unprecedented. It's something that humankind has never experienced, this species has never experienced before. You think about something that's happened just in the last 2 years. Between about March 2020 and the end of April 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, there was an idea, a concept at the beginning of March called physical distancing that nobody had ever heard of really around the planet, maybe one person in 1,000, somebody who, say, had some epidemiological training. And by the end of April 2020, virtually everybody on the planet knew it. Whether they were doing it or not is another thing. But the fact that that information could spread so quickly all over the planet showed a degree of hyperconnectivity, as you can see on this slide, a degree of hyperconnectivity and ability to transfer information that we have never experienced before in this species. And we have abundant scientific knowledge about the nature of the challenges we face. It took Pfizer and Moderna about 2 days after they received the genetic information from the Chinese on the structure of the SARS-CoV-2 virus to run that information through their computers and come up with the basic morphology for their vaccines, the molecular morphology for their vaccines. We happen to know what the problem is with climate change. We understand the physics of climate change, the changes in the radiative balance of the planet, and our models are actually very good at so very different from, say, Europe in the 14th century, during the time of the Black Death, when people really didn't know what the source of the problem was and what they needed to do about it. Now, that knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing enough, fast enough, to deal with the problem of climate change, but we're infinitely better off than previous civilizations and societies that were facing existential crises and existential challenges. So we have these three characteristics, unprecedented characteristics in this current world of hyperconnectivity, abundant scientific knowledge, and then perhaps most importantly, an awareness of common fate, a sense that we either solve these problems together or we're going to die together on this planet. Maybe some wealthy folks will die a bit later than other ones, a few decades later, but the bottom line is you can't go to New Zealand because New Zealand is going to burn too. Every part of the planet is affected by climate change. The changes in radiative fluxes are affecting every part of the planet, and you can't hide. And ultimately, we're not going to take very many people to Mars, despite the best intentions of people like Elon Musk. Next slide, please. We are in a stark situation of common fate now, in a way that is implacable and absolutely unavoidable. And I think many people on the planet are now starting to realize, especially with the advent of the pandemic, in ways that we haven't before. Next slide, please. I love this photograph from the Apollo missions, one of the finest photographs of the Earth that's ever been taken. It's not clear whether it's a dawn or an eclipse, and I think that ambiguity is poignant at this point in time. Next slide, please. Just in the last few minutes, I want to talk about the kind of tipping point possibilities that we might face virtuous cascades of change, not pernicious cascades of change, not cascades of change that take us into a world where, a Mad Max world where we're fighting against each other, but virtuous cascades of change that could take us to a much better place. And it's going to start with the actions of individual people like you and like me. It starts in our minds, and then it's a political process, because it's about power and the distribution of power, who's got it, and what they do with it all over the world. Next slide, please. I tell the story in the book of this woman, young woman, Stephanie May, a Connecticut housewife in the 1950s, who, next slide please, who learned that nuclear weapons being exploded by the United States and the Soviet Union all over the planet in the atmosphere were contaminating the atmosphere and contaminating the food supply. Radioactive isotopes were falling on the fields around the world. Cattle and sheep were eating the grass, and the radioactivity was concentrated in the milk, for instance, that Stephanie was feeding her young children, and increasing the likelihood that they would get leukemia. And rates of leukemia, childhood leukemia, cancer, were increasing all over the world. Stephanie decided this was absolutely appalling, and she decided to do something about it. Next slide, please. She studied hard and learned about the issue, and started developing petitions. She took the petitions to Washington and fundamentally mobilized mothers all over the United States. Next slide, please. Protested in a hunger strike outside the Soviet mission at the United Nations. For days, nobody paid attention to her, and then all of a sudden, television stations from every major network in the United States turned up and interviewed her, and within a few days afterwards, there were hunger strikes against atmospheric testing all over the planet. Oh, excuse me, all over the United States. Next slide, please. And then by 1961, she was speaking in London at the end of the Aldermaston March from a nuclear research station that had ended at Trafalgar Square in London in front of 100,000 people, bringing a message from the mothers of the United States to the mothers of Europe and around the world to stop atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. And by 1963, in significant part because of mothers' mobilization, not just in the West, but also in the Soviet Union, atmospheric testing was banned by the United States and the Soviet Union, and the testing moved underground. And within a few years, atmospheric concentrations of radioactivity started to drop. That shows something about what one person could accomplish, but you might say, oh, but that was a long time ago. It doesn't apply in this day and age. Next slide, please. If on August the 18th, 2018, somebody had said that a girl of 15 years old, 14 or 15, I can't remember exactly how old she was at the time, is going to sit on the steps of the Swedish Parliament building with a small sign saying, "School strike for climate." And that, within a few years, next slide please, she was going to mobilize tens, if not hundreds of millions of people all over the planet to protest climate change. We would have said that's a ridiculous idea, that's impossible. And yet, Greta Thunberg did it, and she's fundamentally altered the trajectory of the discussion, the global discussion around climate change. Again, something accomplished by just one person. This is the possibility of producing virtuous cascades that all of us potentially possess within us. So to conclude, let me just quote the final words of the book. Let's not aim for what's merely feasible and falsely hope it will be enough. Instead, with commanding hope, let's aim for what we'd all consider to be enough to solve the challenges we face, a future in which our children and life on this planet can flourish, and then strive to make that future our reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Thomas. That was that definitely showed me some glimmer of hope. We have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. Let's get into it right away. The first one is from Nisha Ate, asking, how do we instill hope with the lesser advantaged sections of the society, especially children, where they have got marginalized even further due to all the natural calamities, pandemic, and political motives?
Look, it's an enormous problem, and I think that there is a differential responsibility here between those of us who have the privilege, the connections, perhaps the wealth, the social power and social opportunity to actually make a positive difference, and those human beings who are, frankly, obliged to just survive on a day-to-day basis because of the structural circumstances in which they exist. So I think most of the people who are gathered around this discussion today fall into the former category. And we have a special role. The fact remains that Stephanie May was able to spend the time at her kitchen table to develop the petitions, to go to Washington, to lobby the politicians, because she had those opportunities, she had those social connections, she had the income to allow her to do that. Greta Thunberg came from a relatively wealthy family and was able to take the time away from school, and she had good schooling. So many people in the world don't have those opportunities now, and they shouldn't. They can do what they can, but the responsibility is, the level of the responsibility is different. So I think it depends on what opportunities we have, and especially for children. I'm very concerned about burdening young children with the kinds of terrible challenges the world faces right now. With both Ben and Kate, we didn't talk to them about these things until they were 10 or 11 or so. Then they started to find out on their own, so we had to talk to them. But I think that childhood is a very special time, and as much as possible, if we can leave these psychological burdens out of their lives, I think that would be good. They'll have enough struggles in the future.
All right, fair enough. The second question is by Hani Trehan. Do you think the world needs to go back and learn from tribal and indigenous communities which have always had a healthy relationship with nature, instead of the exploitative one that so-called civilized people have had?
Yeah, well, it goes back to something like the agricultural revolution, I guess. So I agree with the general sentiment of the question, but I also know that a lot of indigenous communities did some pretty horrible things to their natural environments, driving herds of buffalo over cliffs and things like that. So, you know, I think that, frankly, if they had been empowered with modern technologies, from rifles to chainsaws to bulldozers, they might have done a lot of damage to their own environments too. However, and this is what I agree with, that there's a fundamental difference in most indigenous ontologies, basically, or their deep assumptions about the world. They're much more relational. They're much more, they're less individualistic, less focused on sort of the isolated characteristics of the individual or the group. Instead, the sense of connectivity, not just to each other, but to the natural world. And that connectivity is something that we have to remind ourselves of. I think this is something absolutely we can learn from indigenous cultures. We are fundamentally dependent upon the natural world around us, and if we ignore it, from everything from pollinators to carbon fluxes around the world, we're going to die because we can't live in the absence of those natural forces and functions and services. So that sense of connectivity is something that very much we can be reminded of, I think, by indigenous cultures around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. There is a question by Mahima Sood asking, are there any communities or countries that serve as an example of healthy, nurturing governance?
Oh boy, I get asked this question. Oh,
is this a
yes.
question you're often asked?
I mean, I do, and I often draw a blank, right? I mean, Bhutan has, national happiness index, and has tried to restructure its measures of gross domestic product of wealth in ways that actually measure people's psychological well-being as opposed to the amount of stuff they consume. But I'm also very aware that it's very easy for, frankly, wealthy folks like me to say, oh, well, we need to consume less stuff. If I go to India and I see what a substantial part of the population is living in desperate, desperate poverty, with barely a pot to their or decent shelter for their families, it's to say, well, we should just start consuming less and we shouldn't be so consumerist. That message really has to be focused ultimately on certain segments of societies, middle and upper classes and upper middle classes around the world who are really consuming too much. So are there societies in the world where there is a better approach, where the government is more nurturing? I would say that there are some that are achieving higher regard for human rights, which is an important starting place, but there's virtually none on the planet that is managing to live within at the moment. Our economies are completely out of balance and out of kilter in terms of their environmental impacts. This is probably the biggest challenge in this book. I identify it as the biggest challenge that we face, is restructuring our economies in ways that make them more sustainable.
Just to continue with this, in my eyes, I don't know, New Zealand seems the perfect place at the moment, politically and, well, environmentally. They do look after their environment a bit, I feel. And so, I mean, that's been a list of countries that I've checked. What are the immigration rules?
I suppose, they have the advantage of being a long way away and sort of on their own. But, I think if you talk to people in the indigenous communities there, I'm not sure they would entirely agree with you. So, and also, New Zealand still depends upon industrial production from all over the planet for everything from the computers like this one that everybody in the society uses, to the electrical vehicles they're trying to roll out across New Zealand, which depend upon cobalt from Congo and lithium from Bolivia. So we have a challenge here, and it's something that everybody can work on, whether you're an engineer, an architect, a designer, an artist, a poet. There are things that need to be done to restructure our societies, especially their economic processes, that have to happen very fast this century. It is by far, if we get the worldview right, if we focus on the renew the future worldview and an appropriate vision of the future, then the next thing we have to do in terms of the practical engagement with the problem is figure out how to run our economies so they don't do us so much damage to the world's environment, especially carbon output. And if you look at New Zealand's per capita carbon output, they're nowhere near zero. I have to tell you that.
Right. Well, so there is a question from Abhishek Thakur asking, can we change our decision-making frameworks as an approach to changing the world? For example, yes, we can choose non-violent forms of decision-making, such as consensus building.
Yes. Okay. So I am originally a conflict scholar. I started out 40 years ago studying causes of war, causes of civil violence and conflict. I think this is the most, in some ways, the first thing we have to make sure is that we don't end up fighting each other if we're going to try to figure out how to adjust our economies and reduce our impact on the environment. It would be so easy for this fear to drive us into a situation globally, whether it's between India and Pakistan, Canada and the United States, between indigenous groups, non-indigenous, rural, urban, to be in a situation where we're simply fighting with each other. So I think there are some fundamental questions about the inefficiencies and deficiencies of democracies, of traditional democracies around the world. Our democratic institutions for the most part, aren't working very well anymore. They're from the 19th or even the 18th centuries, and they're not adapted to the 21st century. And instead, they're being taken over by social media and kind of bubbles of identity groups where people don't speak to anybody outside the bubble, and you get this kind of fragmentation of the perception of reality. You can't run a democracy and solve social problems if people can't even agree on what the problems are. So that's the statement of the problem. I would say, if I've got a second, and I know we've got very little time now, but I would say that the fundamental principle that we have to keep focused in the center of our vision is that those societies that do relatively well are the ones that have a strong sense of the common weal, a common sense of we, right from the top of the society to the bottom. And especially the elites believe they have a responsibility not just for themselves and their own well-being, but for everybody in the society. And that's the kind of ethic that we at least need to develop for the human species, at least enough 5–10% of the human species starts thinking that way in terms of responsibility to the species, not just to their own nation. That's a very fundamental worldview shift. It's going to be hard to achieve, but it's a starting point.
Absolutely. Well, I think you were right. We we are run out of time, and but I wish we could go on because we have so many more questions, and this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for this great talk, Thomas Homer-Dixon. You know, our hope must have a clear vision of a desirable future, is what you
Exactly.
said, and I think that this is something that we all need to manifest, and this is what our farmers did, and they have proven what you have shared with us today. That you know, if you take collective responsibility to the species, then you can make miracles happen.
Yeah, that's right.
uh,
Just like Stephanie May and Greta Thunberg did. So
Absolutely.
thank you to all my friends in India.
And a big thank you to for that straight talk.
Okay.
A thank you to the audience, of course. And this session was presented by Godrej. Tata Literature Live, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects, powered by Godrej, continues with many more sessions. Do check out the website, and if you want to spend some time in a virtual bookshop, head on to landmarkxi.com, a knowledge partner, where you can get yourself Thomas's book, in fact. And with that, I'll be signing off now. See you at the next session.